This is why you cannot start or finish projects, because it has a lot to do with what's going on inside your brain and what is broken. And so I'm going to explain right here the whole process, but also how to actually finally start your projects and finish them consistently. So when we're looking at specifically the brain itself, draw a little brain here, there's multiple components that help what we call as the motivation loop. And there's certain steps that take to actually have motivation to finish projects consistently. And so when we think about the motivation loop, there is one step that first starts the whole process, and that is the cue. So the cue. So I'm going to use this as a representation as a cookie. So we want the cookie, or we want to finish the project. So just think about the cookie as a project that we want to finish. Then from there is the action. The process of actually taking action to getting the reward. So that is action. Okay, then from action, then we get the cookie, or we finish the project, and that is the reward. Then from the reward, especially if it was something that was good, if we liked the experience and we got the reward, we finished the project, it equated to maybe some money involved, because that's why we finished the project, or made our boss happy, or whatever it is, whatever that project had to be, there was a good experience. And from there, to have a good experience, this is where it turns into a memory. And this is important because the memory of that experience of having the cookie or finishing the project is something we want to repeat. We want the brain to be like, oh yeah, we want to repeat this process. And that triggers the cue again. This can be really complicated, and it usually requires understanding what are the components of why you have lack of motivation. And sometimes it requires discovering what are the imbalances. So if you want, you could download my free motivation booster protocol that I use with all my patients and clients to explain what labs to implement and what actions to take to help improve your motivation and have that consistent. And I can get that in the description below. Now, when we're looking at each one of these components, what is broken? Let's look at the first one, which is the cue. So when it comes to the cue, what part of the brain helps with this process? There's a few areas. One is the prefrontal cortex, which is right here, so known as the prefrontal cortex. And then we have what we call is the amygdala, which generally is about around here. And so both the amygdala and also the prefrontal cortex are responsible for starting the process of the cue. So the amygdala is, think about it as the emotional center. It's what gives us the experience of feelings of happiness, excited, to take action, or also stress and scared. So it's really responsible. Did we have a good experience from the memory, like I said, and do we want to repeat the cue? And then the prefrontal cortex is going to think about more logical steps of what do we need to do in order for to get that reward? What are the actions that need to take place? Then it leads into the action, which is more responsible for a few things, which is also the hypothalamus. Generally right there, cortex is responsible for the action. So hypothalamus is more responsible for specifically how our basically energy and drive gets initiated, but also our heart palpitations, increased blood pressure, like physiological things start happening because of the hypothalamus. And then the prefrontal cortex takes the actions of like, okay, I need to get up. It'll actually take the action to get up, go across the room, go to the cookie jar, open it, and get the cookie. Or if it's a project, same thing. Every sequential step that needs to take place is happening right here because of the prefrontal cortex and the hypothalamus. Now, after that's taken, then we finally get the reward. We get the cookie, we finish the project, we get money, or we get a job on the back from our boss or whoever. And because of that, this is known as the nucleus accumbens. Really think about it as the reward center. It's what does get fired. In fact, this area right here, known as the VTA, is what the dopamine is stored, is where it fuels the source, and this will get fired increasingly when we finally get the reward. That's where it's the highest, where we'll see the peak of dopamine happening. And then from the reward, we then finally go and turn it into projects that can be broken. Because this process is also the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex are both responsible of creating a memory. So for the amygdala, it's creating good emotional memories. If that reward caused you to be excited and enjoyed it, more happy, then guess what? The amygdala is going to want to allow for the cue to happen again. Whereas the prefrontal cortex, it's more the logical steps that need to take place to create those memories. So when you want to create the cue, you have those memories built in place of the sequential steps that you need to take in order to finish the project. Now, this is where one of the components is broken of why you can't finish and start projects, is because this experience right here. If you tried a project and it ended up being a bad experience or caused you PTSD or it just wasn't good, guess what? The amygdala is going to protect you. So you'd be scared and afraid to even start that process. So the chances of the cue happening is very low. And this is where we need to break the cycle. So if it was a project you were doing, had a bad experience, it means we need to think about a new way of doing it. But probably more importantly is finding somebody else that has succeeded and successfully and probably did it in a different way. In fact, I would do this in medical school, is if I didn't do good on a grade or did good on a test, then I would look for a different student of how they studied and how they did it differently. And then that would get me excited again. They would want me to study even harder and to do it a different way. And then the reward, I got a better grade. And so then this whole process would repeat itself over and over again. But it's because I looked for a different avenue. And it's the same thing when it comes to business. When you're trying a different method within your business, trying to find somebody that's already done it, has already paved the path, or with your own health, looking for somebody that's already paved the path, helped other people, and that helps with this whole cycle. So it's not broken. That's what usually what is a problem for most people, is because they had a bad experience and therefore they don't want to repeat the process. Now, a few other things that can break this cycle, because I talked about the amygdala, has a lot to do with emotions like stress. If you're in a constant stress state, a lot of times you're always afraid of everything. It's very hard to repeat this process. But one of the biggest issues, it's the fuel source. So the fuel source is, if you think about it, is dopamine. Dopamine is the fuel source of this whole process. So if we look here, dopamine is what fuels the VTA, which then triggers the prefrontal cortex, the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, all of it. And if we don't have enough fuel, a lot of people think, okay, yeah, I just need to take stimulant medications, or I need to take any kind of caffeine or energy drinks just to increase my dopamine. The problem with that is a stimulant. So if we look at this and think about, okay, let's say there's a spigot, and this is what releases the dopamine that's constantly coming out and fueling the brain. Now, what the stimulants do, all it is it's turning this knob. Okay, it's just turning it on. That's all it's doing. But what happens when this runs low? Not a good situation. We need to fill that. What is the ingredients? It's the ingredients that is the issue that needs to be filled constantly. So what are the ingredients? Well, there's several. There's, for example, tyrosine. There's also phenylalanine. There's also zinc, vitamin D. There's also vitamin B6, iron, folate, magnesium. Let's just name a few. And all those are required. So if you're low in these areas, that becomes an issue. We don't have enough juice, what we call the dopamine juice, to fuel the process. And I get this is a lot of information. If you want my help to discover what are the things that are deficient for you and how to fuel this whole process so you increase your motivation, then you should check out the link in the description below, where you can actually book an assessment diagnostic, where I can dive deep into your medical situation to understand why you're having a lack of motivation and how to help you out in that capacity. And again, that's the description below. Okay, so one more thing. How do we know what is causing the deficiencies of not creating the dopamine juice? Well, this is where testing comes into play. We have to test all these different things. But I'll tell you, it isn't just these things that cause it, but those are definitely the ingredients to. There's other things that also hinder from allowing these things to even get filled up to increase levels of dopamine, to increase your dopamine. And so sometimes these could be imbalances in different neurotransmitters than just dopamine. It could be serotonin, it could be norepinephrine, it could be epinephrine. It could also be cortisol imbalances. So there's several things in this area that we have to start replenishing the dopamine. So if you want to know how this whole process works of how to test and identify why you have lack of motivation, you should watch this video next, where I've done over 11,000 different lab tests on my patients with their lack of motivation. And this is exactly what I found out and what are the issues. So watch this video next.